A living dog is better than a dead lion. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Persohn. You can contact me at pastor@mascot.church or in the comments below if they're switched on by the time this video is published. Where does that phrase come from? A living dog is better than a dead lion. Well, it actually comes from the Book of Ecclesiastes, probably written by King Solomon at a darker time in his life, a time when he was less aware of the eternal God and life after death and so on, and quite miserable in his own personal time, as some scholars suggest. We're going to read the passage that comes from in just a moment. But let's have a little better look at the picture behind the image there. And you can see a mangy, terrible looking dog on the one side and a lion on the other. The dog in Middle Eastern culture at the time, and certainly in the Bible, is considered a very low animal. It's if you wanted to insult someone, you would liken them to a dog, or what have you. You would say the dogs do this, or throw it to the dogs, etc. And the lion, of course, the king of the beasts, was considered in Scripture the greatest of the great. Well, the difference here, or the point that the writer is making here, is that a living dog, as miserable and mangy as it might be, certainly is better than a dead lion. And I think you can enjoy that. I think it's worth stimulating your imagination, or it does stimulate the imagination. I use that phrase as an opener regularly in conversations, or maybe as a closer. People talk about the scenario that they have or the life that they live, and I say, well, it's definitely important. I'll say something like, King Solomon wrote, a living dog is better than a dead lion. Almost everybody agrees with that. You know, one of the problems we have these days is that we've lost the sense of thanksgiving. We've really begun to take for granted many of the great things that make our lives as good as they are. You might be saying, well, my life isn't that good. Well, it's time to really stop and think about some things, and think about the way things are in the past and what they could be, etc. today, and where we would be if people hadn't worked together to produce the world that we live in today. Before I go on and talk about some of those things, let's read the scripture from Ecclesiastes, sort of the surrounding text from where my quote comes from. Okay, here it is from the Book of Ecclesiastes. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise in their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices, and to him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner. As he who swears is as he who shuns an oath. There is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live. After that they go to the dead. But he who is joined with all the living has hope, for a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Their love and their hate and their envy have already perished, and forever they have no more share in all that is done under the sun. That is Ecclesiastes 9, 1-6. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Now, this was a time when the writer had lost touch with eternity. So rather than saying that after death, the believer goes on to be with God, it's no, once you're dead, you're out, you're gone, you're cold. And that context is seen in the overall book of Ecclesiastes. Nevertheless, his proverb here, the one we quote, a living dog is better than a dead lion, speaks deeply to our soul and to our life today. Well, one of the things that we need to remember to do is to be thankful. I heard Scottish artist or actor Neil Oliver say on an interview the other day that for 99% of human history, life has been nearly intolerable. Only for the last few years, the last generation, the generation that I am now speaking to, has life been very pleasant and comfortable in comparison. Others have said that all of nature really conspires to kill you, and really conspires to make life extremely difficult. If you hop in the car and drive westward about an hour and a half from where I live, you come to this beautiful scenery. This is the Blue Mountains, New South Wales, Australia. And it looks so pretty and so peaceful and so serene. But just imagine that you were dumped there, and I will give you the good graces of having minimal amount of clothing, and let's say just a pair of shoes and just enough clothing to survive, and maybe a knife. You've got to live in this beautiful nature. Well, how do you think you're going to go? Without some skills, some very well-developed skills, and some extremely hard work, you won't last very long. There's no place to sleep. Everywhere is prickly and nasty and full of bugs and so on. Even though it all appears green, there's almost nothing you can eat out there. You'd have to know exactly what you can eat and what you can't. There may not even be water. In drier times, you'll have to even struggle to find even water. And what about shelter? The heat of the day, the cold of the night. What would your priorities be? Well, I think it would be water, shelter, food, maybe not even in that order. It depends on whatever. And then, of course, if you injure yourself, who's going to fix your body? Who's going to look after things? Yeah, we really have a lot to think about. We take a lot for granted. This video is being published on Mother's Day, and it gave me some time to think about what I would say in a Mother's Day message or whatever, and I pondered and thought about the backdrop of this topic, and then I thought about my grandmother and my mother and the women who raised me and so on in their lives, and remembered something from my early childhood. Here's a picture of a washing machine, a lady with a washing machine that she is using. Some of you may have never seen one of these. I do remember it well. I think we actually had the one on the right, the General Electric version. Well, how did this particular machine work? Well, it had an agitator on the bottom that you'd put your clothes in. It had a wringer at the top. You'd feed the clothes through the wringer and then often back into the agitator. Sometimes you would just feed them through the water, would fall back into the agitator, and then you put the clothes maybe in another bucket for rinsing. Laundry was a tough thing to do. It was largely left up to the ladies. Why? Because the men would work all day long and they would usually come home exhausted, frequently dirty. My grandfather worked in factories, and my other grandfather on the farm. And so who would look after things? He would be gone early in the morning, come back late at night, and kindly his wife would care for them and the children. There was no other way. You simply had to work. Everybody had to work hard and work together just to survive. The great Dutch theologian, I don't remember his first name, Abrakel was his surname. I believe he was the only one of 5 children who survived, and I think that his father was also the only one of 5 or 6 that survived. I should have looked this up before I talked today, but that was very common in the 17 and 1800s, where most of your children would be ill or wouldn't make it or whatever. And you'd just have to struggle. You'd get married as young as possible, have as many children as possible, because there was no welfare net to look after you. There was hospitals were very, very poor, and if you were poor, you were in trouble. And most of our ancestors were poor. I would say today that almost no one in my audience would be willing to exchange their lives for a nobleman or a noblewoman or whatever, a count or a countess or a king or a queen in the Middle Ages. I doubt you'd want to do that, given the things that you would not have. You wouldn't have your electronics, you wouldn't have good medical care, your lifespan was still going to be 40, maybe 50 if you were lucky. 50 was an old person in those days, and life was far, far more miserable, even for the wealthy, than today. Maybe some men might say that they would go back and do that, but I think the majority of women would say there's just no way. Now, those are women who would be noble women, who would be served, but even then, the difficulty. Well, let's come back and have a quick little look at my grandmother's washing machine again. That was a marvelous piece of gear. It had an agitator and a pump. It was electric. But my grandmother also had one of these. That's a scrub board. You might have seen one of those. Well, what do you use that for? Well, if the soap you used wasn't particularly good, you'd get your linen or whatever you're washing, you'd scrub against that board to try to get stains or to get dirt out or whatever. And both my grandmothers had big, strong hands because, well, you just get strong doing that work over time. Now, before the electric washing machine, so I decided to go back and have a little look. I found this really interesting slide. The Happy Day ball-bearing high-speed washing machine saves time, labor, nerves, clothes, strength, and transforms Blue Monday into a bright and happy day. Now you can see that lady has a crank. There's no electricity at the time, and she pulls on this crank. I don't know what she did with the water, if she would preheat it or whatever, but that was a tough bit of work. She would have to crank it. She'd still have to wring the clothing dry, hopefully hang it out somewhere. There was no dryer. If it was wet and it was cold, she'd have to wash. She'd have to hang it inside. It would increase the moisture in the home. I think you're getting the picture. But even today, there are parts of the world where an even less mechanical approach to laundry existed. And you can see this today in parts of the world. You can see this lady working really hard, slapping the clothes against the rock and washing them with soap, again, in a river. And I can certainly say that our ancestors probably did live that way. Well, why do we have this technology today? Imagine what just simply the washing machine did to make life for both women and men easier. Just think about what the washing machine did. How did it come to pass? Well, men and women cooperated together, worked together to say, let's find something better. Let's find a way to reduce the workload, to allow you to get more done in a day, to allow you to perhaps have some time to relax. Well, it's not only appliances like that we need to think about. What would have happened 150 or so, even 100 years ago, if you broke a tooth and had to have it extracted, or you had a toothache? Where would you go? Would you go to a dentist who would be able to give you a drug and play quiet music, and you'd lie back, and next thing you know, you're awake with perhaps a bit of a dry mouth and a small amount of misery, and the tooth extracted or the tooth fixed? What would you do? No, you would not. Here is a drawing of an earlier picture of somebody going to what? The barber to get his teeth out. Yes, the barber. And what kind of drugs did the barber have? Perhaps if you were a little older, you might have had a couple of shots of whiskey or whatever. I don't know. Frankly, did not have time to check it. But the barber used tools like this. Ouch. Yes, that's a dental extractor. I was going to try to wonder if I was trying to wonder how you'd use it, and just got too squeamish to even think about it. Yes, times have improved. Even noblemen, even kings and queens of 100, 200, 400, etc. years ago still had to endure pain like that if they needed a tooth out. I saw some pictures of people on a barber's chair with a towel wrapped on his head, and somebody holding the towels back and holding his arms just so he would stay in place because the pain was so great while a tooth was being extracted. Wow. I don't believe anybody here would want to go back into to that time and live in those days with those limits, plus, of course, all the things that you would miss out on. Hey, do you know what happened today, this morning? I had a miracle take place in my home. Yes, let me show you what happened. We've got one of these. Looks a lot like this. I turned that lever to the left, to my left, and pushed it up and waited for a moment, and water came out, and soon the water was hot. Hot water in my home. Now, how many of you have that? How many of you got hot? Probably everybody in this audience. Of course, if I took that lever and spun the lever the other way, cold water would come out, which I could drink. Amazing, amazing. It's actually nearly miraculous. Well, the water that I had that came into my home came from this dam, and this dam is about 100 kilometers from where I live. So somehow the water came 100 kilometers. No, it didn't come in a truck. I didn't have to go and grab it in a bucket and then heat the water to do it. No, it just came. It just happened. The rain was collected in the dam, the water was treated, and it made it to my home, and I was able to turn it on and turn it off on demand. But the water is hot. So not only did the water come to my home, electricity came to my home that was generated in a machine like this that's about 130 or 150 kilometers from my home. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. The electricity came, I don't know where, don't even care. If it breaks, I complain. Yeah, if I don't have water, I complain like mad, but it's still here all the time. Now imagine how your great-grandparents lived. When they needed water, it was a well that had to get out the back. It may or may not have been clean or dirty, who knows. If they needed to heat it, they needed a fire. Did they have a shower? Well, you'd have a bath once a week simply because of how hard it was to bath. Daily shower, out of the question. And what about you? Could you have a daily shower? Could you have a bath more than once a week? Of course you can. Are you grateful? There is the question. Now, what we have today is a culture and a world where murmuring and complaining seems to be the norm, where people no longer want to cooperate, at least at a certain level, and they'd rather fight with one another. My group is this, your group is that, and we're always going to fight together, and so on. There's a kind of a movement in our world today, which is a bit amazing for an old guy like me to look back on, especially someone who's read his history, that simply wants to break everything down and restart it. Do you know how hard that would be? Rather than saying, we're on a good foundation, let's work together to improve what we've got. No, they want to say, well, let's tear society down, let's rebuild it from the ground up, kind of year zero, and see what we can do. Do you really want to go back to living in the bush with a knife? Because that's pretty much what it'll be if we were to do that. It'll be anarchy. Well, this whole problem of people murmuring when they have lots is not a new problem. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and I'm going to read a verse to you here. Oh, two verses, a couple of verses. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Look at this second statement. Nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed of the destroyer. There's a thing about grumbling that opens you up to destruction. Have you ever noticed that? There's a thing about being ungrateful and dissatisfied and failing to see the good that's there, that opens the door to a lot of misery. And today what we're seeing is a lot of grumbling and a lot of mumbling and a lot of complaining. A lot of very privileged people griping and complaining and sniping at one another instead of working together. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not going to end well, I can assure you. I'm making this video in 2021, and I think it would be fair to say that in 2019 we reached peak freedom. In 2019, you could take, maybe 2017, 18, 19, certainly around that time, you could take a bundle of cash, go to an airport or a credit card, buy a ticket, fly anywhere in the world. As long as you had a passport, nobody would care. Nobody would be looking over your shoulder. There was no concern of pandemics or of whatever. You could just do whatever you wanted to do. Today, our world has changed dramatically. Most people I see live in fear and ingratitude. I should say many people I see live in fear, and they live in ingratitude. We also saw in 2020 that this seemed like it was the perfect opportunity for people to really start complaining at a high level, burning things down and so on. I'm really concerned that cannot end well. In a world of plenty, we've just become way too greedy. I've got a friend who pastors a church in the East Coast of the United States, and he said that he said in a message that he was asked or invited to attend a going away dinner for a priest who had functioned in his community. And the priest had been there for 60 years. 60 years. And the priest had an opportunity to speak, to thank everybody for coming and so on in his retirement speech. And he said, we Catholics hear confession. Now, we're not Catholic, I'm not, but this is the priest speaking. We hear confession. People come and they tell us about things they've done wrong in their lives, and we tell them how they should pray and so on. Now, again, I'm not Catholic. It's not a thing we do in our culture, but certainly Catholics do that. And the priest said, it's interesting. He said, in my 60 years, people have come to me with all sorts of things that they've done, all sorts of crimes or all sorts of wickedness and evil in their lives, but never once has anyone come forward to me and said, please, Father, you need to understand I have a problem with greed, with covetousness, with wanting stuff I shouldn't have. Well, that's the last of the commandments. Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's. You shouldn't greedily demand or desire what is not for you. And it's so interesting that our society is one today where greed seems to be not just good, but very good. The actual engine of our society. And when we don't have what we want, what do? We grumble and we complain. Yes, well, the purpose of my message today is to say that what we need is gratitude, not complaint. And to encourage you on this day to develop and to keep and to maintain an attitude of gratitude. I know that sounds like a silly sort of pithy statement, but I like it. Let's see what it says in Romans about this very thing. Very interesting passage here. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they're without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal men and birds and animals and creeping things. Yes, what they did instead of being grateful was they didn't acknowledge God, and they began to think about the creation as being God itself. Isn't that curious? Now that passage was not written to believers in general or about believers in general, but about everybody. That sense, that lack of gratefulness is a dangerous thing, and it brings clouds of trouble along the way. I think we're losing our freedoms, and we're losing a lot of the good things we have, and I'm going to say that one of the things that would keep it is an attitude of gratefulness and an attitude of joy and cooperation between people. This is not such a high-end spiritual talk today, more a motivator to say, hey, keep your attitude in a good place. Now, rather than gratitude and working together, we see people who are really prepared to fight with each other and would rather do that. Let's look at what the scripture says. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, look at this. But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you're not yet ready, for you're all still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? When one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not merely human? So Paul is saying here, while there's jealousy and strife among you, you're just behaving like just normal people, just like babies. Well, I like that passage. It speaks to me. It says, jealousy and strife and the tension that comes is a thing that's got to be put down. And it's got to be replaced with a thankful and a grateful heart that's willing to work together, that's willing to enjoy the good things, take the foundation we have and make it better rather than try to tear it apart. Here's another passage from two different translations, James chapter 3 and verse 16. Here's the English Standard Version. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. And James 3:16, for where envying and strife is, there's confusion and every evil work. I've seen it. I've been in ministry for 40 plus years now. I've seen this happen again and again and again. People get into strife, they get into envy and whatever between one another, and trouble ensues. Trouble just pours itself out everywhere. It's a trouble storm, and an unbelievably difficult time can come because people just will not work together, and they're just wanting to get into complaining and into difficulty and so on. There's a wonderful psalm and songs. The word sounds similar, but the action is also similar, or the meaning. The 133rd Psalm that talks about working together and the fact that God sees us as a blessing. Now I want you to have in your mind and say, and just when I read this and say, does not speak about people who are complaining and people who are groaning and moaning and people who are taking things for granted. This talks about people who are content in themselves, who are walking in love, who are walking with God. Listen to the 133rd Psalm here. Behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like the precious oil on the head running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon which falls on the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. Where did God command the blessing? God commanded the blessing there when his people dwell together in unity. in unity and in harmony and in peace, there's blessing. Okay, what have I said today? A living dog is better than a dead lion. Be grateful for the fact that we are alive. Be grateful for the good things that we have. See what has happened and what we have, because men and women and people from all over the world have cooperated together to make things easier. We basically conquered nature to make life better. You don't want to go living in the bush or the jungle or the desert anymore, unless you're living in a nice home or whatever, then you can enjoy what is there. No, nature itself will try to kill you every day. What we've done is we have risen in many respects above it. We have so many miraculous, well, nearly miraculous things in our home. We've got running water, clean clothes, clean air, windows. Have you ever stopped to think about windows and curtains, just how wonderful they are, the warm bed that you sleep in, the refrigerator that keeps your food fresh? Ladies and gentlemen, we need to develop and keep an attitude of gratitude. Be grateful to God that He's allowed these things into our lives, and realize that if we don't, we could lose it. Yes, my name is Al Persohn. You can contact me at pastor@mascot.church or in the comments below if they are published when the video is on. A living dog is better than a dead lion.